Right. Well, a very good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome to this, our last seminar in the Lent term series here at the Axon Johnson Centre for the Study of Classical Architecture at Downing College in Cambridge. Our last seminar of the Lent term, and indeed our last one, therefore, until we restart in the autumn, the Michaelmas term, with our next series of seminars. We've got beautiful spring weather has arrived here in Cambridge. We've got the crocuses and the daffodils are all out at Downing College, which is probably rather more than the case in Aberdeen.
Yeah,
where
there was frost.
There was frost when he left Aberdeen.
Yeah.
You probably win the prize for our most northerly UK-based speaker, I think.
I think I'm closer to the polar bears than I am to
exactly. So a great pleasure to welcome Karl Kinsella from the University of Aberdeen. Karl is a lecturer in art history, but in a complicated department or faculty that involves divinity.
Yes, in the school of Divinity, History and Philosophy,
and
art history, yes.
And that seems to be particularly befitting for somebody who specializes in medieval art and architecture. And I think Karl is probably the second speaker we've had who specializes in medieval architecture. And it'll be very fascinating to hear what he's going to talk to us about today, which he tells me is a new project he's starting to build up. So we're the guinea pigs.
I'm afraid so.
For that. And his topic has the rather fascinating title of After Vitruvius, Architectural Triads in the 12th Century. And we're going to hear all about that.
Thank you
in
so
the next
much.
45 minutes or so. Well, welcome, Karl. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm delighted to have got the invite for this and to speak to a sort of totally new audience for me. And as Frank says, it's a new project. So I'm really interested in the sort of questions afterwards as much as anything. So tracing Vitruvius's De Architectura during the Middle Ages is useful and has been done plenty because it gives us a sense of the classic text's legacy, but it tells us something about the writer's reception history as well, and it allows us to think about why medieval authors read De Architectura in the first place, and I think more importantly, what value if any, did they find in it. Many of us are aware of Poggio Bracciolini's rediscovery of it in the St. Gall Library at the beginning of the 15th century, acting as a sort of catalyst for so much of happened subsequent to that. But the work was well known from the Carolingian period onwards, as we'll see throughout this talk. And I'm interested in the ways in which medieval authors not only copied it, because as we'll see, there's plenty of that happening, but how they read it as much as anything else. Because, as I said, this project in a sort of larger aims is about coming up with a theory of medieval architecture that would have been recognizable to people at the time. And I think we can, and if we're going to do that, Vitruvius is a good starting point, because that is the only treatise that the people that we'll talk about would have access to. And we should expect some engagement with Vitruvius in the period, since we get nothing less than a building boom in the 12th century, especially the sort of monastic and city architecture. The Cistercians, for example, the sort of aesthetic order established at the end of the 11th century, goes from a couple of houses at the beginning of the century to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds at the end of it. And this is in combination with the great renovations of the cathedrals, the development of the Gothic style in the middle of the century. All of this is happening in the built environment, as they call it, of this century. And despite the sort of wealth of material sources, there's a perception there's a remarkably little written about this by people at the time. And this is likely because and I think the implication of that is sort of that they weren't interested in it, or even worse, that they didn't have the critical faculties to do it in the first place. Beyond seeing architecture, and the church architecture especially, as a sort of heuristic, intellectual, spiritual device for understanding, which is absolutely part of it. But I want to understand the sort of stones and the mortar of these sorts of conversations. And the issue here, in many ways, is the sources, right? Absolutely, I fully recognize that. There is no major architectural treatise written between Vitruvius in the 1st century BC and Alberti's in the 15th. But the lack of a written genre does not mean that the 12th century authors that we'll talk about were not indifferent, or were indifferent to the changes that were going on around them. Indeed, they were deeply concerned about them. And it's it's just difficult to know what a medieval architectural treatise would look like if we found it in the first place. Would we even recognize it as such? After all, we don't even, in the 12th century, we don't even really have architects. That is a sort of, a word is known, but is often the way in which we understand that term really only arrives in the 13th century. Either way, a treatise in the vein of Vitruvius's does not only seem unlikely in the 12th century, but nearly impossible within the cultural and scientific framework for the time. So, to my mind, it's useful to draw upon the work of authors who did have interest in architecture, but did not build. Now, I'm saying that because in reality, I actually don't have a choice. But the authors were almost uniformly churchmen. And a consequence of this is that even though they did not build, they were not architects, they were often the patrons for these major works. And the commissions, and I suspect, needed to speak a sort of architectural language of a kind in order to properly understand what the builders were doing and to communicate their own desires and the desires of their brothers, especially within monastic architecture. Clients in every period, I suspect, have opinions about what they want, and they need to be able to communicate that in essence. So today I'm going to move through some of these sources and demonstrate that even if Vitruvius's influence can be difficult to discern, although as we'll see sometimes it's very obvious, De Architectura does seem to have indirectly provided a framework for writing about architecture, especially, and I think from the 12th century onward. And I'll go a bit as to why I think that might be. So, as I said, despite the sort of common perception that there's little writing about architecture in the 12th century, in fact, there's plenty of it, both positive and negative, as we'll see. And with so many monastic and secular and defensive buildings being constructed, it shouldn't be much of a surprise that there was some reaction and thought about what makes a successful building or not. The real problem, however, is that many of these discussions appear in theological works, as much as anything. And their character, the aim of them, the audiences are quite different compared to what we might expect of an architectural treatise or something of a bit more, I have written there practical use, but that's a bit, I don't quite agree with it, something more sort of material use to it. So as I'll discuss later, we do get manuals for craftspeople making glass, metalwork and painting. But this is likely, I suspect, because that type of work was carried out by monks or members of the lay communities at the time. But monks did not build, generally speaking. I think we can probably assume that. They employed people to do it. And so when churchmen wrote about architecture, they could expect their audience to be aware of the processes around building, and the organization of the work, because there's so much building happening in the 12th century in these monastic centers. They're almost permanent building sites, or they must have been sort of perceived to be at the very least. So we can expect these texts to be read by patrons of some of Europe's largest building projects at the time, people who discussed and worked with builders to determine the appearance and layout of their spaces. And while Vitruvius's dedication to Augustus is, likely a cry in the dark, Vitruvius's aim was likely not to speak to other architects, I suspect, but to elevate that practice of architecture to the status of the liberal arts. And its status, so De Architectura's status in the Middle Ages, as we'll see, was largely valued as a source for technical Latin vocabulary, as opposed to the actual sort of work. But I do think that the content of Vitruvius's discussions, especially in the first book, did have an impact. So we don't get architectural treatise, but I do think, and this is the larger project, we can begin to think about architectural theories beginning from the 12th century to the later Middle Ages, depending on your definition of that term. Written, albeit in unfamiliar places, in the middle of these texts about the heart and the dwelling of the god and the temple of Jerusalem and places like that. So today I'm going to go through some aspects of Vitruvius's influence on the discussion of medieval architecture. Not so much as sort of pattern spotting, because that's already been done, but of suggesting something a little bit more expansive in the search for such a thing as a medieval theory of architecture or medieval theories of architecture. We'll think about what we know for certain, which is plenty, about the medieval Vitruvius before focusing on the works of the canons based on the Abbey of Saint-Victor on Paris's left bank, namely this guy here, Hugh of Saint Victor, and the Scottish author Richard of Saint Victor as well, who I'll talk briefly about. The truth is we don't get anything so dogmatic as in the Middle Ages. They're not systematic in the use of language. And when you're looking for perfect alignment between authors separated by a century sometimes, there will be differences. But I think there's enough here to make this argument, although you will tell me that, I hope. So there's plenty of accounts of Vitruvius's afterlife during the Middle Ages. But I wanted to highlight a couple of points. First, and perhaps most importantly, at the very least, de architecture was well known in the Middle Ages. Bracciolini's rediscovery is a sort of it's not quite propaganda, but it's sort of convenient story about the Middle Ages as much about the early modern period. At least from the Carolingian period onwards. And Stefan Schuler identified 132 manuscript copies up to the 19th century. Within that, there are 97 from between the 9th and the 15th century, but just over half of those are from the 15th century alone. Altogether, for our purposes, there are 48 known manuscripts copied up to about the year 1400, but only 6 of these containing the late antique abridgment by Faventinus. So there's plenty there. That's quite a lot for a classical work that was not normally part of medieval curricula. There's plenty of Ovid and Virgil and the like, but it is quite a large number. So we can speak about medieval Vitruvius in a significant way, and at the very least expect it to have some influence on the writings and thought about architecture from the 12th century. Having said that, I have to acknowledge that there's no indication that masons or later architects are reading Vitruvius, or at least so far anyway. Up to the 12th century, most of those manuscript copies are complete enough to at least convey most of the text. From the 12th century onwards, we tend to get more fragmented versions of Vitruvius disseminated. Prior to that, we get the whole work. We see a shift in the location of where it's copied as well, starting with the Carolingian Empire, then from the 12th century in the Anglo-French world, and then from 1400s to Italy. And what's striking about this is these sorts of changes absolutely map on very well to how other classical works were changed and used within the Middle Ages. Vitruvius doesn't stand out particularly. It aligns quite well with all of these works, more broadly speaking. There's plenty of references directly from the work across genres, from texts such as Abelard's Sic et Non, a highly logical text, to liturgical works by William of Saint-Thierry, De Sacramentis Altaris, both from 12th century France. For the most part, interest in Vitruvius focused on the wealth of, as I said, his unusual vocabulary, meaning that the text and the architectural language used to convey was the primary sort of interest for these sorts of authors. Wim Verbal's conclusion is from this information is that his writings, and I quote, on architecture were known, but they were read as dealing in the first place with spiritual, not material construction, and therefore Vitruvius was not taken simply as a technical authority. In essence, the Christian framework for the reception of classical knowledge was filtered through the cathedral schools and into a theological context where De Architectura could be useful in so much that it could be used to understand the hidden reality, the theological world, more so than anything about the sort of nuts and bolts of building. And this is pretty common. And Verbal is absolutely correct. I'd recommend his work on medieval Vitruvius is excellent. But however, as we'd see, I think there's more to this story, that when churchmen talk about allegory, the inner reality of the truth of something, fundamentally, they need to know what the external material reality is first. And once they know that, they can build on it and understand the allegorical content. But they have to know what it actually is in the first place. So to illustrate that, before we get to the language of triads, it's useful to illustrate just how interested the canons of Saint Victor were in some of the practical aspects of architecture. And while their work suggests that Verbal is absolutely right, to claim that this sort of focus on the theological truths supposedly within Vitruvius was important to them, I think he overemphasizes the point. At the very least, he doesn't incorporate this wider spectrum of approaches to classical works that use them to say something about the world itself and not just the sort of theologizing that might go on. Hugh of Saint Victor saw creation, as he called it, as a second scripture, that it was as important as the biblical text itself, and so could be the object of the same sort of study as the biblical text as well. So to illustrate this, we have the Scottish theologian who dies in 1172, Richard of Saint Victor's commentary on the book of Ezekiel. Richard quite explicitly is not concerned with allegory. Indeed, he deliberately goes against it. And he is determined to write a literal explanation of what the prophet Ezekiel describes in an architectural vision that runs from chapter 40 to 48 of the biblical scripture. And in that, the prophet gives a long, and some might say painstaking, description of the temple and the atria that surrounded it, that would come down from heaven once the Israelites returned from their exile in Babylonia. And previous sort of explanations of this saw it only as a temple of the imagination. There was no literal version of this. For Richard, and for the Victorines more widely, that was not good enough. You had to have a literal understanding of the actual text. And for Richard, in order to sort of explain this, he provides what he says, all of these images, plans, elevations, as you'll see in a moment, so that everybody, no matter how simple, that's the word he uses, simplex they might be, they can understand the truth of his recreation. So to run you through it, he runs from the sort of more sort of simple plan to the more complex. This is the sort of image on the top left of the entire structure, the walls, the atria. And then the sort of next view give a little bit more detail. The top there gives the navy rectangle, indicates the location of the temple itself, just attached to the inner atrium there, and all the buildings around it. But he goes even further. This is a plan of the entire atria, along with plans of the gatehouses that join each of the atria together, along with the sort of probably something like a loggia running alongside it. Then he goes into more detail about the gatehouse itself. This is a general plan of the gatehouse, plan of half it, and then the entire plan. And then he gives the elevations for the entire, all of the gatehouses too. This is the front elevation, and this is a sectional elevation of the lateral elevation of the gatehouse. So you can see the slope of the mountain. It's sectional because you can see those rooms on the ground floor running up along it. It is, as far as I know, the first sectional elevation in the history of architectural drawing. Also interesting, Richard also uses the term plan in reference to his plans, which is, I think, the first time the word is used in reference to an architectural drawing. I can talk about that, or you can read my book, which is available at all good bookshops. Well, half-decent bookshops, maybe. So that's what's happening in Saint Victor in terms of architecture towards the later part of the 12th century. They are interested in architecture. They're interested in representing it. They are interested in understanding the very real material reality of what it looks like. Richard does not talk about allegory in any way in this work. So that leads us on to Hugh. Hugh of Saint Victor was Richard's mentor, dies in 1141 in Paris. He was a teacher, author, geometer, theologian. He was nothing less than a 12th century Renaissance man. He was immensely influential both in his own time and long after his death. This is 12th century Paris. It's an Augustine Abbey. So this is the center of Paris. And here is Saint Victor just outside the city walls there. It's an immensely important foundation, both for Hugh, for writing, and a great other reasons. It's a very influential, had an open school for the first half of the 12th century, or having been established in 1141. So anybody could really go and learn there under Hugh. It was a royally endowed foundation, which essentially means it had lots of money from the very beginning. And its library became incredibly famous as a result. But its library was well endowed from the very beginning as well. So much so that a lot of people end up there. Thomas Becket goes there when he's in exile. William de Verne, the first chancellor of the University of Paris, is buried there, or was buried there. It's no longer standing. There's the worst cafe in Paris is now on top of it, I think, anyway. There may have been, we know there's a copy of De Architectura in the library in the 14th century. I suspect there's probably one there at the end, at the very least, of the 12th century as well. But we don't have direct evidence in the sort of list of manuscripts that were there, but they're always incomplete. We know they had a copy of Euclid's Elements as well by the middle of the 12th century, which is probably Adelard of Bath's translation of it. But Hugh certainly knew of De Architectura and references it explicitly more than once. In his outline for a curriculum known as the Didascalicon, he writes on the authors for the mechanical arts. And at the end of the list, he writes, I'll just say, there are Vitruvius on architecture and Palladius on agriculture. Most of this list is taken directly from the 7th century Isidore of Seville's same discussion. But the end of it, so from Vitruvius onwards, is Hugh's addition to it. So he's at the very least aware of it. So if we're looking for Saint Victor or Vitruvius in the 12th century, Saint Victor is a pretty good place to start. But just because he references, anybody who's read an undergraduate essay, just because he references doesn't mean he's read it. And so we need to sort of have a bit more information as to what's happening. So we'll sort of lead into this. Vitruvius's first section concerning the education of the architect, which is mostly what I'm concerned with here. He makes a distinction between theory and practice, where the former involves using the necessary materials and the latter the ability to explain certain matters. Sorry, that's reversed. Later in the same section, he discusses the importance of geometry to the architect, describing how it teaches us to use the rule and compass by which especially we acquire readiness in making plans for buildings. So one of Hugh's other works was his Practical Geometry, which is a genuinely innovative work for its time because it's concerned with what it sounds like, the actual application of geometry to problems. Do I have the thing here? So, and there's plenty of manuscript copies of this. Richard certainly read it in preparation for his commentary on Ezekiel, and its influence is especially apparent in works of practical geometry, such as Fibonacci's, who borrows Hugh's structuring for the work. In this, Hugh makes a similar distinction between practical and theoretical geometry, writing that, do I have? Yeah, so in this, Hugh makes a similar distinction. So writing that we note that geometry is either theoretical or practical. Theoretical geometry uses sheer intellectual reflection to study spaces and intervals of rational dimensions, but practical geometry uses instruments. Hugh, I said, it makes these sort of distinctions between practice and theory as well, which is sort of an early example of this. Now, I'm not saying he's taken it from geometry, from Vitruvius, and it'd be nice to say when he talks about space, he's talking about architectural space, but spatio in the Middle Ages tends to be used for geometrical spaces, although it is sometimes used for architectural space, which I'm happy to talk about. But when it comes to the triads itself, Hugh's interest in architecture mainly is focused on the Ark of Noah. Unlike the case of Ezekiel, there's plenty of attempts to understand the appearance of the Ark throughout the Middle Ages and beyond, and most notably by St. Augustine. Augustine thought the shape to be something like a floating box, which is like here. I love these animals here. And Hugh takes a much more practical explanation. He describes himself walking down to the Seine, not far, as you've seen from Saint Victor, and seeing the boats there, and says, well, Augustine's wrong because the boat, or Noah's Ark, has to have a keel, otherwise it flips over. And so he's looking at the world around him and then trying to extrapolate from that back into the biblical text to understand the literal reality of it. In response, more generally, Hugh lectured on Noah's Ark in around the 1220s or thereabouts, with his students taking notes and working them up into a more comprehensive theology. It's something like a summa before the advent, or for the sort of heyday of scholasticism in the 13th century, but it uses the sort of visual language of the ark to structure it. And it comes in two parts, the moral ark and the mystic ark, although the titles probably aren't contemporary. And the latter, this moral ark, is long, highly geometrical explanation of how to make the arc with compass and rule as well. If real, there's some conversation, quite heated, about whether it physically existed or not. This is Konrad Rudolph's recreation based on Hugh's description of it. The arc is the sort of, you see the arc in plan. It's that sort of central series of three rectangles in the middle. It would have been monumental. Not sure it really ever physically existed because there's absolutely no physical evidence that it did, either in manuscript or as a wall painting, really. And he used, the way he describes it is clearly derived from practices in contemporary geometry that was developing in this period. So Verbal's observation that the spiritual framework for an architectural language such as this holds absolutely true, especially the lecture section as opposed to the geometrical section. But my argument here is that while authors such as Hugh and others named to describe and change the inner spiritual reality of the readers, it's founded in a very real sense what architecture is. And he offers a triad in his arc texts. The first chapter of the fourth book is called Where and Whence God's House is Built. Spoiler alert, it's in us. But essentially, yeah, the answer is that. And in this section, Hugh includes two triads. The first results from Hugh's reflecting on the three things necessary when constructing a house physically. He said, well, not this one, but you need place, material, and the person making it, the artifacts. Doesn't say architect, it says artifacts. And I'm not going to discuss this too much, but it's worth making the point at this stage that Hugh is following a pattern that he does throughout his writings. First and foremost, he is, I think, out of all the sort of identities I gave you, he is a teacher and wants to make things as plain as possible. So when he uses language such as this, such as sort of describing it in a triad of place and artifacts and material, he's not innovating. I think feels like he's talking to an audience who already understand that that is knows that that's the case. The first triad was recognized as such. Soon after this discussion, Hugh offers another kind of triad, one which resonates with Vitruvius quite well. He writes that in all things with building, there are three principal matters that ought to be considered: order, arrangement, and certain dimension, definitio dimensiono, having principles and defined boundaries, which I think maps on quite well. So when I talk about the sort of Vitruvian triad, I'm not talking about the well-known triad. I'm talking about one that appears earlier in the text that Hugh does not reference, but Hugh has picked up, I think, on something else in Vitruvius's De Architectura, as I've sort of put them together here. I don't know why this comes out with asterisks instead of italics, but there we go. That Vitruvius words, now architecture consists of order and of arrangement and of proportion and symmetry, which is not a triad. Absolutely recognize that Vitruvius doesn't give a triad for this, but I think Hugh has transformed it into a triad. He's just tidied up the last section of symmetry design into this weird phrasing of definitio dimensionum, which has sort of philosophical ideas later in the 13th century, but I think he's talking about these sort of design elements in architecture. Hugh continues by following Vitruvius' structure when discussing each of these components in turn. Hugh's discussion of ordo, revolves around the need to focus on one's heart, mainly away from earthly things, of course, and he recognized that the discussion of the world are potentially infinite, and having an ordered heart, as he calls it, allows one to focus attention where it is necessary. So for Hugh, order is the process through which something is made stable, and the correctness of procedure more so than anything else. The plan of a building comes under dispositio, and that we've seen that it's possible to take this quite literally in the case of Richard of Saint-Victor. And at the end of the century, there's criticisms of Richard's drawings that they're too elaborate and they actually distract from the main purpose. But in the criticisms, the drawings are referred to as dispositio, and there's clearly a connection contemporaries made between them. And then we have this proportion and symmetry sort of condensed into definite dimension. And I suspect here that, okay, triads is obviously quite important within a Christian framework, and it's and that's the sort of numerological sort of content of that is absolutely possible. But I suspect what's happening here is elsewhere in another text, Hugh talks quite a lot about memory and the importance of memory. And one of the key parts of how memory should function is through conciseness, brevity, brevitas. And I think Hugh likes ordered lists of things in order so that they sort of remain fresh in his reader's memory. Because remember, he's talking to students. This is fundamentally, probably originally, a lecture rather than an actual sort of something he set out to write. So overall, I suspect that Hugh is working in a similar manner to Richard's process of starting with the literal truth. These things apply to actual architecture as well as inner sort of spiritual truths as well. Next, we have an author contemporary with Hugh who uses a similar triad, but in a work quite different to the ARC, theological manuals. I said Vitruvius' technical vocabulary was a major reason why it was read, but there are enough exceptions to this, I think, to indicate sort of they had an impact. To this end, Theophilus' early 12th century work known as De Diversis Artibus is a collection of 3 books that explains how to make things with glass, metalwork, and painting. And one of the distinctive features of this work is that it actually rings true. It's probably a reasonably accurate, other than the reference of phoenix blood, for example, but there's largely an accurate account of how a lot of this stuff was made. Unlike other contemporary manuals, unfortunately we don't know who Theophilus was, or even if he was a he, or even if he was a single person. And in that book, there's 3 prefaces, one for each of the arts, which describe a sense of the religious and spiritual potential for practicing the arts, and describes that his aim is not like Vitruvius. He wants to sort of take these practices of metalwork and painting and upgrade them, that they're not just mechanical arts, i.e. mindless sort of making with the hands, but they are in fact they emulate God's act of creation, that you too can create something new and innovative. And then he talks about architecture in the preface for metalwork, and the earthly reality which the church is, and is a pale imitation of the original act of God. He writes that, wherefore, dearest son, when you have adorned his house with such embellishment and with such a variety of work, you will no doubt but believe, do I have this? Oh, that's the next one. That you will no doubt but believe in a full faith. So Theophilus is deliberately playing with an allegory of the temple here, right? There is the real temple, which is the church that he goes, if it's a monastic text, the church that he goes to every day. And then there's the temple of the body as well, similar to Hugh. This is a sort of current running throughout it. Later on then, he says, through the spirit of wisdom, you know that all things created proceed from God, and without him, nothing is. Through the spirit of understanding, you have perceived the capacity for skill, the order, variety, and measure with which you pursue your varied work. So this triad, like Hugh's, begins with order, although it's slightly different to both the ARC text and the Vitruvian one, in that we have variety there. I suspect in this case, the sort of disposizione, so the plan drawing of it, should contain variety, as opposed to it being an aspect of variety itself. Robert Bork has talked quite a bit about the overlap between architecture, design, and metalwork, especially in the making of microarchitecture in the sort of 13th and 14th century. So it sort of is those 2 sort of methods sort of chime quite well. So we have another sort of form of this triad. I said, if you're looking for exact Vitruvian triad, we wouldn't even expect it in the Middle Ages, but we are getting sort of the variation on a theme, I suspect. The final of our triad of triads, so 3 authors, we have a similar use in terms of the relation to architectural criticism. So Hugh is telling us that all architecture should contain these characteristics. Theophilus is telling, well, all good design contains these 3 characteristics. Our third author from the end of the 12th century, Hugh of Forlì, is actually saying, well, he's looking at the Gothic buildings around him, and he's saying, well, these things don't contain these characteristics. He's criticizing the world that he sees around him and does not like what he sees. It's too ostentatious. It's distracting from the true purpose of architecture, which chimes with Hugh and the others as well, that it should relate to the inner reality. But he writes it using this similar triad as well. There are three principles that should be observed in buildings: position, arrangement, and construction, so that by their location, they are set apart from the secular world. By their arrangement, they keep secular persons at a distance, and by their construction, they are not excessive, but useful. Utilitas, maybe. Like Theophilus, the triad is not quite the same. But seems to assume that a sort of tripartite description of good architecture, or bad architecture in this case as well, that the work is a genuine piece of architectural criticism, since Hugh spends more time writing about what he sees are the problems, and that it's a theory, I suspect, because it applies to everything else as well, or it should apply to all forms of architecture. That it's not just this specific building that he complains about, but lots of them. So, and the biggest difference here is the lack of order or position. But I suspect that's just, when he talks about position, I think he's talking about, it relates to order in that, you know, the correct position within an order of something should be followed. So that's three 12th century authors who have a certain sense of what makes good and bad architecture. And later Hugh could certainly have read earlier Hugh of Saint-Victor. Indeed, it's usually safe to assume most authors after him have read him, but there's no real reason to assume he's read the arc texts. They're huge. Maybe he has, maybe don't. I mean, he may have taken it from Hugh of Saint-Victor as opposed to Vitruvius, but there's no reason to think that Theophilus and Hugh of Saint-Victor know of each other. They're writing almost exactly the same time, and yet they still seem to use these sort of triads distinct from one another. That to me suggests that there's a wider notion of this sort of triadic structure for the engagement with architecture at the beginning of the 12th century that feeds into conversations about it in the later 12th century, such as here, but also into the 13th as well. It gets a bit more complicated when the scholastics come along. Conclusions are probably the most important part of this, having established that Vitruvius was known to these and other authors. Because I'm reminded of Eddie McParland, more so. I was taught by Eddie in my undergraduate. I still have nightmares of Eddie telling us in our slide test, you have to keep asking so what at the end of them. Keep asking so what. I have told Eddie that, so he won't mind me saying. And it's true, so what? So what if there's a Vitruvius in the Middle Ages? And that's the interesting part, I think. And at the very least, we can point to some implicit and previously unknown examples of Vitruvian-ish triads in rather important 12th century texts. These are not texts that exist in a library in the middle of nowhere that nobody else looks at. These are popular, well-known works. Theophilus is a bit fewer in 5 texts, but it becomes better known. And it adds to the discussion of Stefan Schuler and Wim Verbal. However, most of these conversations are carried out within the realms of Latin literature. And so their influence on architecture, real or imagined, is often sort of lost to some degree. And if we could broaden our conclusions somewhat, where should we take them? Where's the so what? Well, we have two authors distinct from each other in Theophilus and Hugh, who've not only, I suspect, read Vitruvius, but attempted to embed some of the ideas into their own work when it comes to looking at architecture generally. Hugh says all buildings should have these things. And I do not think Hugh and Theophilus are innovating here either. I don't think Hugh is sort of making this up. I think he's trying to speak to an audience who rather expect this as well. They have already a sense of what architecture should be, and his innovation is applying that to the spiritual realm. And so essentially the argument is that, well, it's sort of what Richard is doing with his commentary on Ezekiel, that is previous to him writing, is all about the spiritual. It could only be a temple of the imagination. Well, what if these writings also can be related to actual architecture? And I don't think that's too far-fetched. I think they're looking for criteria for understanding the world around them and to articulating their thoughts about, the distinct changes between Romanesque and the new style of Gothic architecture, and who best to look at and pick up the ideas than somebody like Vitruvius, who, as we've seen, is quite well known in this period. And the idea that they're only concerned with immaterial matters is just not true. And not that anybody said that's a straw man, it's just not true. However, it tends to be overemphasized, I think, that the Victorines especially have a structure for understanding history that the literal, actual aspect or reality of it needs to be understood first and foremost. And so I think that can apply to, as Hugh says, the second creation, i.e. the world around them, as much as it can to the biblical text or any of the buildings described therein. Thank you very much.